Hey guys, welcome to Platitude US History. This one's over Thomas Jefferson, and we're going to talk about him as a president. We've already talked about him a lot for other things, but before we can talk about his actual presidency, however, we have to talk about the election of 1800. Now, to sum it up into a tidy package, the election of 1800 is actually called the Revolution of 1800. Because it was a full-on regime change. We moved from one political party, the Federalists, to another political party, the Democratic Republicans. And basically, that changeover happened without any bloodshed. People went peacefully. And so the bloodless revolution of 1800, in which we have a victory for the Constitution and a peaceful power change. That's the tidy package. The truth of the matter is that it was a very nasty election. It was bitter. There were campaign attacks and counterattacks. There were crazy press coverage, dire warnings, fear-mongering. It was angry and dirty and crisis-ridden. And there was this bitter battle between Adams and Jefferson, who had been friends for a long time, but then weren't anymore. And it was very crazy. And by the end of it, there was an electoral college tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr, basically, so what that means, when that happens, the vote goes to the House. And so guess who's in charge of the House at this point? Alexander Hamilton. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, they don't like each other. Like, even more than Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton don't like each other. Because Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson just didn't agree politically. But Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton actually hated each other. Legitimately hated each other. And so when the House has to decide, Alexander Hamilton throws his vote to Thomas Jefferson, allowing Thomas Jefferson to be president, and now Aaron Burr is the vice president. Which, by the way, this leads to the passing of the 12th Amendment, in which the vice president and the president now run as a ticket, as opposed to first and second place. But because Alexander Hamilton, this is cast his vote for Thomas Jefferson, this is where the whole, insult happened. The kernel that really starts the huge feud that's going to culminate in the duel between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton and will lead to the end of Alexander Hamilton's life. Now, like I said, Thomas Jefferson is elected. Now, he's elected in November, but inauguration date at this point is March of the following year. So, March of the following year, Thomas Jefferson delivers his first inaugural address, and that really went a long way to soothe the wounds of the election of 1800 and to alleviate fears of this changeover, because, he really did talk about all of us coming together and uniting, and we are all Federalists, we are all Democratic Republicans, because we are all Americans. Now, part of that is the tradition it's a tradition now, it was not then, but it's a tradition now, in which politicians, they campaign on a platform that is usually pretty extreme. So if this is your political spectrum, right, and on one hand is the far extreme version of one political party, and on the other hand is the far extreme version of another political party, right, your candidates usually campaign on those extremes. However, what happens usually once they get elected is they move far closer to the middle. They become much more moderate because as the president you represent all Americans, and you have to accommodate for so many different people and so many different agendas and so many different interests, and can't show favoritism. At least that's how Thomas Jefferson felt, and that's how most presidents, they will take that lead, right? But let's actually look at what he promised in his campaign. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson was a big supporter of strict constructionist view of the Constitution, meaning that it had to be explicitly stated as the power of the federal government. Otherwise, based on the 10th Amendment, it was a state power and should not be the federal government should not overstep their bounds. because Thomas Jefferson really did believe that states' rights were the best defense against a slide back into monarchy. Okay, so Jefferson promised a frugal government. He promised to pay off all the debts because he believed in frugality. He believed in eliminating the national debt. He did not agree with Alexander Hamilton that it was a good thing to have. He also wanted a small bureaucracy, so he wanted to decrease the size of the federal government. He didn't want a standing army. He wanted that just to be state militias, to only be called up in times of emergency, but nobody is actually, that's just what their job is. He wanted a coastal navy, meaning he wanted a navy, but not a very big navy, just a navy to provide coastal defense. He believed in free trade. He did not believe in any kind of import duties or taxes. He wanted everyone to openly trade evenly because that is the definition to him of economic freedom. He did not believe in treaties with Europe because he found them to be entangling alliances that would pull America into European wars over and over and over again, and we couldn't afford to do that. We shouldn't want to do that. So he did not want to do that. He believed in freedom of religion. He believed in freedom of press. He spoke about the importance of freedom of speech. He believed in the progress of science, and he was very pro-French because, you know, they had just had their French Revolution and yay, 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 eliminating monarchies. Now, he becomes president, inauguration, gets into office. So let's talk about the things he actually did. So he does reduce the military to more of a police force of about 2,500 because he's trying to stay true to his ideals. He really wanted to forswear military in lieu of peaceful coercion, which is the use of diplomacy and think of them like trade sanctions. It's something that we still use today. And that's because he really did believe that a military was a step towards dictatorship, especially a large military. So that part he stayed true. He moved away from his ideals by keeping most of Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. The only thing he's going to eliminate of that financial plan is the excise tax. So in that respect, he gets rid of an economic barrier for farmers, but he keeps the Bank of the United States. He keeps state funding. He keeps paying off debts at par. So, you know, he did not change very much because he did believe in consistency, and it was kind of actually working. Yeah. But here's the thing. He does reduce the national debt. He doesn't eliminate it entirely. So in part of it, he does stay true to it because he does reduce it. He was the kind of guy, he eschewed the pomp of the presidency. So what that means is he, at the inauguration celebration, instead of having a parade and him in a carriage and the whole, like, waving thing, you know, right? He actually just walked like everybody else. He just walked amongst everyone to the inauguration celebration, and that was him. That's what he did. Whenever there were state dinners, he had what was called like this pell-mell system of seating, basically meaning he didn't believe in social or political hierarchy. So what he said, first come, first serve. You sit where you sit. So it was this crazy situation in which people are in the Capitol building running towards the table to eat dinner to get the best seats, right? And he was okay with that. He believed in frugality over finery because that's how he felt the government should be, that there shouldn't be really neat pomp or circumstance around what he felt was actually your duty to your country. Also, he did not go to Congress to deliver speeches. He sent messengers with written messages? That sounds wrong. Messages. Good Lord. Anyway. And those were just read out loud. Part of that, though, however, is not really him being like, oh, well, I'm staying true to my ideals. It was more that he actually had a fear of speaking in public. And he didn't like to give speeches in front of large crowds. Okay, so let's talk about some other things he did. He repealed the Alien and Sedition Acts and pardoned all of the people who had been imprisoned under those acts. So in that respect, he definitely stayed true because he repealed it or pushed for the repeal based on the idea that it was way too much power in the federal government's hands, and it was really going after a certain sector of society. He established a small navy for coastal defense, and it was so small that a Federalist congressman actually joked and called it Thomas Jefferson's mosquito fleet. Um, but I mean, he did stay true at first to his ideals, but then we had issues with the Barbary pirates over Tripoli, Barbary States area. And he ended up using that fleet for more than just coastal defense. What happens is the Barbary pirates have been, stopping boats and stealing and taking money and whatever, ransom, for forever and ever. And people just usually pay them off to receive free passage through the area. But Thomas Jefferson refused to pay, and so the Pasha of Tripoli, the Pasha of the Barbary States, decides that he is going to declare war on the United States, and so Thomas Jefferson uses his mosquito fleet to go fight Barbary pirates, and we win. But that's kind of an overstep, right? That something else he does that's pretty huge, maybe you've heard of it, it's called the Louisiana Purchase. So here's what happens with the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson he really, really wants New Orleans. So because of Pinckney's Treaty, we now have access to the Mississippi River. But at this point, the French now own New Orleans and Louisiana. And by the way, Louisiana was not the little shoe that's right next to Texas now. No. Louisiana was it's this huge portion of what we now think of as a modern continental United States. So when he wants New Orleans, and so he sends ambassadors over to France, and he knows that France needs the money because, they're at war. Go Napoleon, right? War against the world. And he knows they need money, and he's thinking, okay, so maybe we can convince them to sell us New Orleans. But the ambassadors are told that the most that they can spend is $10 million. That's based on because Congress controls the purse strings, so that is based on congressional edict. $10 million, that's the max. So the guys go over there, and they're talking, and everything's great, and France says basically, look, we really need the money, and we need it right now. So we're not waiting, but we'd be willing to sell you the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, including New Orleans, for $15 million. So that's $5 million more than Congress has allowed. But it's so much more land. And this is very exciting, and Thomas Jefferson pushes it through, and he says, yes, go for it, go ahead, without necessarily gaining congressional approval. So this is a huge overstep. Even Thomas Jefferson thought it was a huge overstep of his powers. He really felt like he had violated his own ideals and the Constitution and the people, but he set all that aside because, well, it's a lot of land for really cheap. It was like 3 cents an acre, something like that, 3 or 4 cents an acre. And so this was like a holy crap moment of maybe abusing presidential power. I don't know. All right, so some other things that don't necessarily stay true to his party is that when he became president, everyone in his party and the Democratic Republicans believed that he would start firing all the Federalists, get rid of all of them, like clean house, and then use the spoil system and reappoint all of these people that are part of his party. But he doesn't do that because he really does genuinely believe in consistency and consistency of power. So he kept the Federalists in. He also believed that it would go a long way in soothing Federalist fears that they were going to be eliminated from politics. So, whatever. All right. Now, there is something we need to talk about, and that is Thomas Jefferson's war against the Supreme Court. Now, here's what happens. John Adams in that lame duck period between the November when Thomas Jefferson was elected and the March when Thomas Jefferson actually was inaugurated into office, that whole period, John Adams really pushes for an act to go through called the Judiciary Act of 1801. And the Judiciary Act basically increases the numbers of judges that sit the bench on the Supreme Court to 16. And then he immediately and hurriedly fills those positions with Federalist judges. And the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be John Marshall, who is a huge Federalist. And we'll talk more about him later. But basically, these judges are called midnight judges. It's a derogatory term because of how late they were placed on the bench and the dubious nature of the Judiciary Act of 1801. Anyway, but as it turns out, that the Supreme Court does become the last Federalist stronghold for the next, 15, 20 years. So it does actually, the reasoning wasn't too far off. Okay, so when Thomas Jefferson gets into office, he's like, no, this cannot stand. This cannot stay this way. And he kind of convinces Congress, which at this point is now Democratic Republican, he convinces them to repeal the Judiciary Act eventually, but immediately upon getting off, well, not immediately, but pretty close, pretty soon into his first term, he calls for the impeachment of 2 judges, both of them very anti-Jefferson, very anti-Democratic Republican. And one of them is John Pickering. And John Pickering, on top of being anti-Jefferson, he was also a lunatic, actually certifiable, pretty much insane, and a raging alcoholic. So his party, the Federalists, decided, you know what, maybe this was not a good idea, and they go ahead, they strict party vote, they take Pickering out of office. He's gone. All right. The other guy that Jefferson goes after is Samuel Chase. Now, Samuel Chase was a massive jerk. He would scream at people from the bench. He was a horrible human being, but he was of able mind and of able body, and he could do his job. He was not insane. He was not an alcoholic. He had nothing that was preventing him from actually doing his job and doing it, decently well. So he was not recalled and from the bench. He was not pulled down. And Thomas Jefferson was livid, very upset. Okay, now, final major act that we need to talk about in Thomas Jefferson's second term towards the end of his presidency, which, by the way, he consciously decided that he was only going to serve for 2 terms. Okay? So he cements that practice. George Washington started it. Thomas Jefferson cements it. All right, so last major act is the Embargo Act of 1807. And here's what's happening. France and Britain are at war. Again. Always. And at first, it's great for us. Trade goes through the roof. We're making buku bucks because we're selling to both sides. It's awesome. But then both sides try to use the U.S. as a pawn, and they essentially declare trade with the other country illegal. Meaning they're passing laws that are telling us that it's illegal for us to trade with the other country, and that's not okay. They don't have the right to do that, and so. We don't stop. We still continue to trade with both sides. But unfortunately, the British start impressing our sailors again, and they start seizing our cargoes again and boarding our ships again. And it's going to culminate in probably the worst event, the Chesapeake Affair. Happens in 1807, and basically the British ship Leopold fires on the U.S. ship Chesapeake because the Chesapeake captain refused to allow the British sailors to board and seize sailors and cargo. So when he refused, the Leopold opened fire, killing 3 Americans. The Chesapeake limps back to port, and in response, Thomas Jefferson pushes through the Embargo Act of 1807 going, "Ha-ha, I'll show you, you can't do it without our stuff from the United States." And so he bans all British ships from U.S. ports, and he orders up a militia, a standing military, and he suspends trade with all of Europe, and he's like, "I'll show them." No, he didn't. He did not show them. It was disastrous for the economy because it turns out that we actually needed them more than they needed us. They had a lot of other colonies that they could actually pull from. We were just one piece, right? So unfortunately, it didn't really work out for us, and he did not really stay true to his ideals in that act either. He had a standing army, he closed off trade, he had major federal oversight of individual free and restricted individual freedoms, especially economic freedoms. So while he's saying it's all about peaceful coercion, yeah, it didn't really work out for us. And so when James Madison takes over after Thomas Jefferson, he really he receives the country kind of in shambles, economic shambles, foreign policies in shambles. It's kind of a nightmare for him, poor Madison. But he's going to take the blame for it. Just wait. Anyway, so that's Jefferson as a president. He stayed true to some of his ideals. He did not stay true to others. And because of that, I think that's why he really did not see being president as the highlight of his life and will not even put it on his gravestone. So, yay. All right. Oh, wait. I have a little bird I have to show. Where did it go? Oh, yeah. Boop. Bye, guys.